Hi, Karolina. Welcome to Network Capital. In this podcast, we try and demystify mental models and understand why people do what they do. Could you get us started by telling us who you are and what's your occupation?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I am employed at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in Stockholm, where I am working in the climate change and risk team. And I am from Sweden, although this institute is international, so the topics that we handle mainly range from weapons industry, production, manufacturing, and nuclear. Though in the past 3-4 years, there's also been this program on more contemporary peace and security related issues, and that's how climate has been brought into the institute. And that's what I do, and that's what gets me a salary between 9 to 5. And otherwise, I am part of the Global Shapers community, which is a global community for the younger generation that involves in volunteer projects locally across 400 cities and hubs around the world. And there I am part of the curating team in the Stockholm hub.
That's wonderful. And if I'm given to understand, you just got back from Davos. Could you tell us a bit more about what were your top 3 takeaways from the experience?
Yes, indeed. So I was invited to Davos because of my engagement in the Global Shapers community, where the World Economic Forum is sending 50 out of the 10,000 shapers to the World Economic Forum annual meeting yearly. And so the delegation of 50 shapers were included fellow shapers from all kinds of corners of the world, from Bangladesh to Kenya to Venezuela and also Sweden. So we were there to have a seat at the table, to be able to sit on the front row and ask questions and be a group that can actually stand for values instead of standing for other sort of corporate interests, for example. So we represent ourselves and our community. And so takeaways were many, and it's been really hard to sort of summarize what was the biggest surprise or
Well, let's start with the learning. You had written about climate change as a subject close to your heart. Maybe you could talk to us about that.
Yeah. So what makes it to the headlines with Davos is I see as quite bombastic and quite contrasting to what you actually experience when you are there. I mean, what we saw from Davos this year was essentially Trump, of course, and also Thunberg, so Greta Thunberg and Trump on each side of the spectra. But in between there, you have the actual attendees of the forum, which I get the impression that many people are there with more genuine agendas than what I had expected, and that includes ambitions within climate. And so, of course, I was part of this cluster within the shapers that came to Davos with the eyes and ears open to really hear what's going on the climate side. And the new manifesto that was released by the forum, which is an update of an old manifest called revolving around stakeholder capitalism. So the inclusion of sort of society and the respect for human rights and environment into the corporate sphere. And I found that was that really was a zeitgeist, and so was climate. And we just have different ways of approaching it, and of course we see it with different lenses. And we were also fortunate enough to engage with the Fridays for Future that were there, and we had an exclusive conversation with them about climate. And I thought it was almost painful to see that there's really a gap between how the young climate activists and school strikers are striving for systems change and they have very good insight into what needs to what the science is promoting that should be done and what is about to happen if we don't. At the same time, there's the current decision makers and leaders that just they're not as updated and not as sophisticated often in terms of what the latest knowledge is. And there's a rather painful gap in the conversations that we also saw, and I think that's a conversation that is important to have about the gap between what the school strikers and other climate activists foresee and what the leaders think that can or should be done. And often we talk about educating the young, when in fact I think it's about educating those in power now and parliamentarians, politicians to lessen the gap, because we don't have time to wait for these generations to take leading positions, at least those kinds of positions that we see of influence in Davos, although of course this community is extremely influential compared to the means that they have. So this kind of contrast or conflict between young and older generations was clearer than I thought that it would be, and also the approach that the business community has. I think they are trying, but it's just not what is expected from a more radical point of view, which seems to be the sort of ambition that we need if we are going to, considering how little time we have to adjust to resilience in this question. But overall, it was a positive experience, and a lot of insights that were that I'm optimistic about. There seems to be some kind of momentum.
Yeah, I was in Davos as a shaper a couple of years back, and I thought that it's an amazing platform to bring different stakeholders from the public sector, private sector together and really initiate some difficult conversations, some tough dialogues. But obviously, you understand climate change and other forces much deeper because it's part of your job, it's part of your curiosity at a day-to-day level. Tell me about some of the most interesting sessions or discussions that you had at Davos, and if they changed your mind about something, we'd love to know.
Sure, there were many, and I guess that I'm the sort of person that brings it up often. So then you end up having a lot of conversations on this. But I was part of a panel on called Responding to a Global Water Crisis. And what I mentioned was that water is one of the first elements or parts of our daily lives in which we will actually feel and already feel man-made climate change, and as well as man-made environmental change, of course. And that is that means that that's an opportunity to boost resilience to climate change through water action. And that conversation was almost exclusively with corporates and business actors, so Ecolab, Coca-Cola, Suez, and also a previous Indian minister, and as well a Chinese director for an environmental institute. And that conversation was, I mean, since there's so much, that was really a reflection of the power of the capital that is in Davos. I mean, I've heard that it's a fourth of global GDP that ends up on that mountaintop for a week. So that was quite obvious during that session, where once it was over, the ideas that we had crafted during the session and brainstormed, one idea that surfaced was a prize, a blue prize for youth community engagement or community innovation or even water innovation. And so that came up, and I suggested that the World Economic Forum could boost such an initiative. And we only closed the panels and thanked each other, and then there was an actor that came up and said that they could fund this. And for me, that was such a powerful insight, that if we do jump on this momentum and these insights, and we identify in which concrete ways that we can approach climate change and nurture resilience, then we can actually we can do something. And that was so encouraging.
That is indeed. And tell me about your experience about the entire subject. Like, how did you get interested in climate change and natural sciences altogether? What is something that you picked up in college? What were some early influences in your life? The reason I ask you this question is that essentially our community is focused on understanding why people do what they do. And you've built a career to solve a problem that you're particularly interested in solving. So our listeners are very interested in understanding what was the beginning point, and how did you follow your curiosity?
Yeah, indeed, Utkarsh, it's true. I also identify as curious, as you have mentioned, and that led me to travel and backpack and meet people from all walks of life in many different places. And what is ever present is our relationship to the natural world and our dependence on the natural world. We all breathe the same oxygen, drink the same water, enjoy the same sun, and it's also it's what sustains life, but it's also one of our grandest problems. The way that we approach our natural world, and it can be done best if it's done collectively on a global scale. So this was a really natural cross-pollination between my interest in the world as a whole and in the ways that we are connected in this world, which is through our common home, which is our planet. And I had a bit of a hard time engaging in Sweden on these questions, because the most obvious way to engage as a rather young person is through civil society organization or political organization. And the environmental communities in particular are usually about saying no. It's to say no to doing this, stop doing that, stop with the plastic, stop with the nuclear, stop with the pollution, and so on. And it's hard to drive that kind of movement and to be encouraged by it. And so it took a while to sort of settle in this question, although it was always something that occupied and worried me. But it was through a row of mistakes that I ended up in this employment that I'm in today, which is essentially about analyzing how the UN, the African Union, the European Union, the multilateral institutions in general are adapting their language, mainly their security language, to climate change, and how to adapt that. And that was by a mistake that I ended up there, because I did an internship with the permanent mission of Sweden to the UN in New York during our membership in the Security Council, and there Sweden was doing footwork around climate change as an issue to be tabled in the council, and sort of interrogating whether it would make sense to have it on the council, so be treated as a peace and security question. And not only doing that, there was a lot of thinking around how can the UN incorporate environment and climate into their peace missions and operations in a way that makes sense and that is actually building resilience and being conflict sensitive at the same time. And all of a sudden there was this whole new world that opened for me with how one could engage through diplomacy and through politics and through sort of behind the curtains in a way that would actually make and adjust a whole old institution to something so contemporary and new. So that was something that was that was so interesting that I thought that I wanted to dwell deeper into it, and so I wrote a thesis about climate resettlement in Colombia. So I went there to interview people that had been resettled, and later on it also brought me to the position I'm in today, which is at the institute that was giving advice and did research for the Swedes during this time. So it's very intimately linked to the position I was in as an intern and what I learned there and what I do now. So yeah, that's how
you make it sound very easy, but it's a lot more than serendipity. It's luck is where hard work meets preparation, and of course there are times when we hack luck, and you clearly made luck and serendipity work for you. But I understand that yes, sometimes chance also plays a huge role, but only if we are well prepared. Mentors play an important role. Are there some in your life who've played a pivotal role in nudging you towards the right direction or pointing you through a dilemma?
I actually haven't had any professional mentors, though I'm realizing now that it is such an amazing concept, and it cannot be it cannot be emphasized enough what a difference it can make, because you don't see the whole horizon when you're just in the beginning of any career or in the beginning of the end of studies or similar positions. And it's the insight and wisdom that people that have been around, whether it's in your potential industry or another one, can be incredible. I think the only person that I come to think of now is really my granddad, who was great at narrating his life and his choices, and that gave me inspiration to see my life as a very long story that had only begun. So that would be my answer to that.
And absolutely, our grandparents, essentially trying to trace the roots sometimes can be a very interesting journey. And so can travel, so can books. Are there some travels or some books or some adventures that have helped shape your career so far?
All of them. Yes, I spent some significant time on really just exploring and figuring out what to do, and I did that for 2 years between 18 and 20, and then at 20 I kind of realized I needed some intellectual stimulation ASAP. So I went back to think what I had been wanting to do previously, and I had set up a decision or a promise to myself that if I don't know what to do with my life, I'll just go for something that's going to take a long time to learn, and that will occupy me for years. And that will be Chinese, Russian, or Arabic language. So I went for Chinese. And I ended up in China, in Tianjin. So a city that not that many are familiar with, except perhaps if you are associated to the World Economic Forum. But it's a city of 12 million in close to Beijing, and I ended up there at a university to study Chinese, and I didn't know much about China, and I didn't know anyone there either. There wasn't. I was the only European exchange student, and the rest were from Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Korea, and did not speak English. So I had to learn Chinese real quick. But that also meant that I did spend a lot of time not being understood and a lot of time in isolation, partly because of the language, but also because the blocking of Google, Instagram, and so on.
And just to be clear, you were what, 20? How old were you when this was going on?
Yes, exactly. And I spent only a half a year there in total, but it was a very lonely half a year, so it felt like a long time. But what happened was that the Tianjin is also one of the most polluted cities, and it was very rare to have a blue day. But once, when we did have blue skies, I asked around my fellow classmates why this was, and they said, well, I guess they turned off the factories because there's some kind of official visit, maybe. And that was it was just said with a shoulder shrug. And for me, it was just mind-blowing that they could turn off factories because of a governmental visit, and it would change the entire weather. And B, that it wasn't a big deal, according to people. So this was a huge realization that, this is how powerful countries, states, individuals can be. And that's what led me to think that, okay, Chinese as a language and linguistics, it is indeed one of the most fun ways that I like to spend my days. But these questions about power and organization, states, influences, and just global affairs was something so immense that I felt like I had to spend time on that. And that's what led me to political science, and also the climax of politics is, or if you're interested in international questions, it kind of naturally leads you to, for example, the United Nations. So I thought that's what I want to learn about. So that's how I ended up where I am now. 5 years later, I am indeed here in New York right now to work around the United Nations. So that's one travel and
where do you want to take your career now?
Sweden.
That sounds massively interesting. Like a 20-year-old, 19-year-old girl moves to China in a language she doesn't, in a place she's not familiar with, and then really discovers herself and her career choices. Very, very inspiring. Talk to me about your career plans. Like, where do you want to shape your career? What next for you?
Yeah, so going to Davos really opened my eyes in terms of, many things, but also naturally being a political scientist, I've been very focused on states, and this opened my horizon for the private sector and those kinds of power players as well, and the ecosystem that exists beyond the states that I've been used to analyzing. And so that was quite inspiring, and obviously the public-private partnership is something where I think that I could play a role, or I could find extremely interesting, and also see opportunities in how that could how partnerships for climate resilience is very potent in that arena. But in general, I want to continue on the path that has to do with risk and climate change. So yeah, it's as so many other things. It's a question that is, you sort of create it as you go, and I'm looking forward to find out what may be happening in the future.
Yeah, that's the thing about career plans. I mean, there's nothing wrong in having a plan. In fact, it helps to have a hypothesis as long as we keep our eyes and ears open to new possibilities. In a way, we have to accelerate serendipity and give it a true chance, which, summits and platforms like the Global Shapers provide.
Yeah.
Tell me, what advice do you have for people in their early 20s who want to build a career solving a tough, thorny problem they can't solve themselves?
Yeah.
Alone.
Yeah. Actually, now that you posed this question, and I relate back to what brought me to China, which was actually just the hunger for a challenge and the genuine openness I felt for devoting myself to something that this will be difficult, and this will take time, and this will change me and my life, and I am open to wherever that takes me. And I think that appreciating the challenge and to sort of love it can be the deal breaker for whether you will be sustained on the path that you choose, regardless of which one that you choose.
That is powerful advice. Thank you very much, Karolina. We really appreciate the time that you've spent. And now we look forward to hosting you on the Network Capital Masterclass. Treasure your time and keep doing what you're doing. More power to you.
Thank you so much, Utkarsh. I look forward.